So now that we know about AJAX and APIs, let's actually make our first API call. So in this lecture, we're going to build a nice UI component such as this one here, which contains data about a certain country. And this data about the countries is actually going to come from a third-party online API. So just as we learned it in the last video. So here we have this first card for Portugal, and then another card for the USA. And of course, this would work for any country in the world. And this is actually really exciting stuff to me. So I think it feels really magical and next level to be able to do this. So to kind of magically get this kind of data from the internet and then work with it in any application that we're building. And so let's now start working on this. And as always, I already have my starter files up here in VS Code. And I also already started the live server. And so that's what I have here open. And so now let's get to work. Now in JavaScript, there are actually multiple ways of doing AJAX calls, but we're going to start with the most old school one. And that's called the XMLHttpRequest function. So we can do new XMLHttpRequest. So just this one here. So we call this function, and then all we need to do for now is to store the result in a new variable. So let's call this one request. And so that's the first step of using the XMLHttpRequest way of doing AJAX calls. Now again, as I mentioned, this is the old school way of doing AJAX in JavaScript, but I'm still showing it to you for two reasons. So first, I want you to know that XMLHttpRequest exists because you might actually need it in the future. And second, I want to show you how AJAX calls used to be handled with events and callback functions. And so only after that, we should move on to a more modern way of handling asynchronous JavaScript, which is going to be a feature called promises. But anyway, next we need the URL to which we will make the AJAX call. So we can now say request, so that object that we created here, .open, and then here first we need to pass in the type of request. And remember that the type of HTTP request to get data is simply called get. And second, we need a string containing the URL to which the AJAX call should actually be made. So let me now show you the API that I selected for this project and also how we can use it so that you can actually understand how you could do something similar yourself. So on GitHub, there is this huge repository, as you can see here, which is called public APIs. And so if you just Google for that, I'm sure that you will find it. And here is a list of a ton of public and free APIs that you can use. So we have all these different categories here. And so there's really an API for everything. So just as I said in the last video. And the one that we are going to use is called REST countries. So it's this one here. All right. So we see here that, well, this is a big table. So we see that the API we are going to use needs no authentication. I think it uses HTTPS, and I'm not sure about CORS. And this one here is important. So any API that you use here should always have CORS set to yes, or maybe to unknown. All right. And CORS stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And without CORS, we cannot access a third-party API from our own code. And so going back here, well, now it's gone. Here it is. So you see, it doesn't need authentication and it uses HTTPS. So this is a good one. And so let's click it, which will take us basically to the documentation page. And now here I'm simply looking for a so-called API endpoint. And so the endpoint is essentially just another name for the URL that we need. So here we have the first URL, and this one is basically for all countries. So if we wanted to get a list of all the countries from this API, we could make an AJAX call to this URL here. Okay? But that's not what we want. Instead, I want to search the API by country name. And so therefore, this here is the URL that I'm going to use. So let's copy it. And I hope that you followed these steps here. And if not, you can of course simply paste it here. All right. And I will start with Portugal, but you can of course use your own country. So with this, we basically open the request, and now next we need to also send it. So you see there are a lot of steps involved when using this way of doing an AJAX call. Okay, and so this will now send off the request to this URL here. Now, in order to get the result, we couldn't simply do maybe something like this. So set some variable simply to this result here. And the reason why we cannot do this is because the result is simply not there yet, right? So this AJAX call that we just send off here is being done in the background while the rest of the code keeps running. And so this is the asynchronous non-blocking behavior that we talked about in the last lecture. So let's get rid of this. And instead, what we need to do is to register a callback on the request object for the load event. So request, and then again our old friend add event listener. And here on the request, we will wait for the load event. So again, here we basically send off the request. And so that request then fetches the data in the background. And then once that is done, it will emit the load event. And so using this event listener, we are waiting for that event. And so as soon as the data arrives, this callback function here will be called. Now, let's then actually log the result to the console. So the this keyword inside of this function is the request, right? So we could also do request, but let's just use the this keyword. And then the response is in the property response text. And again, this property here is of course only going to be set once the data has actually arrived, right? So if we tried to set it out here, then that wouldn't work, of course. So we can still try that just to see request.response text. And so that would be exactly the same as this one. And well, already we have our first data here. So that's great. And as you see, this is the result of our very first AJAX call. So great job. This already worked. And you see that this kind of looks like a bunch of data about Portugal indeed. Now we just need to convert this here to an actual JavaScript object, because what we have here right now is JSON. So remember that JSON is basically just a big string of text. And so what we need to do here is to then convert that. We already did that before, actually. So that's JSON.parse this.response text. So let's then take a look at the data. And by the way, as you see here, of course, the result of request.response text out here is nothing, right? So let's get rid of it. And so indeed, here we have this object with all this data about Portugal. So we have the capital, which is Lisbon. We have the flag even. So basically a link to the image of the flag. And indeed, this is where we're going to get this flag here from. And then all kinds of other stuff, like the location, the population, region, and so on and so forth. Now you see that this is actually an array containing one object. And so let's quickly destructure that like this. So remember, that would be the same thing as doing this, right? But of course, destructuring is a lot more beautiful. And so now we got immediately the object here. Great. And now we can actually build that card component. And so let's copy the HTML here from this comment. So open the index.html file, get the HTML from there, and then we can create a template literal that we then have to fill up. Here I'm of course missing the name, and as always I'm calling it HTML. And so now all we have to do is to replace this data. So let's open it to see what we actually have. So here we are actually starting with the image. So we need a source, and of course that source can be any URL. It doesn't have to be a local image that we have on our computer. And so the one we will use is this one here. And so that is at data.flag. Next up, this is where the actual name of the country goes. So data dot, and where, yeah. So down here is the name. Then here, I also want the region. So that would be Europe in this case. And so this is the one. So that's data dot region. And then finally, we also want some information about the population, language, and currency. And all of that is present here in this data. So that's at data.population. And so this here is basically 10 million. So we don't want to display this entire number. So let's just round it to 10.3 or 10.4 million. So the way we can do that is to convert this first to a number. So as always, I'm just using plus for that. Then divide it by 1,000,000. So yeah, that's 1,000,000. And then let's round this value finally. So this is a number, and so on a number we can call 2 fixed with 1 decimal place. Next up, language. So I'm doing this pretty fast because here we are basically just practicing what we already know, right? So again, this one is for languages, and so let's see. So languages is basically an array. Oh, now I clicked, and so now it's gone. So let me just put something else here for now, because this was causing the error. So let's see. In languages, we have multiple here, as you see. And so what we want is simply the first element of the languages and then the name. And the same is actually going to happen with the currencies. So we also have an array of the currencies, and then we want the name of the first one. So again, we want data.languages, the first element, and from there we want to take the name, and the same with the currencies. Currencies. All right, and that should be it. And now all we have to do is to then actually insert this HTML into our page. So I actually already have it here selected, but just to make it complete, let me show it to you. So we have this countries element here, and so that's what I call the countries container. And so here we want country.insert adjacent HTML before end, and then the HTML that we just created. Now finally, we also need to set the style of this container to opacity 1. So let me show you that one also in the code. So I set the opacity of the countries container here to 0. And so now we set it to 1 so that we can then see a nice animation, which is going to be triggered by this transition. Okay. First, let's give us some space so we can then actually see it. And so, as I just said, we need to say countries container dot style dot opacity and set it to 1. And now as I save it, the data should appear, and it does. So that's amazing, right? And it looks just like here in our demo. So that's fantastic. I really love it when it works just like this. So getting data from some third-party API really feels like magic to me. Now let's actually reuse the same code here to create an element like this for multiple countries. And so what I'm going to do is to put all of this into a function. Let's call it getCountryData. And so this one will take a string as an input of a country. Okay, so the curly brace down here. And then here, instead of hard coding Portugal, we will use that country that we get as an input. All right, country. And now down here, we can then call this function getCountryData Portugal. So let's see. And yep, that worked just the same. And now let's try another one. So let's try the United States of America, just like I had it in my demo. And here we go. So now we have data about 2 countries. And by calling these functions here twice, we will basically have 2 AJAX calls happening at the same time. So in parallel, so to say. And if we reload this page here a couple of times, then they might appear in a different order. And the reason for that is basically that the data arrives at a slightly different time each time that we're loading the page. And so, in fact, this really shows the non-blocking behavior in action. So as we call getCountryData here with Portugal for the very first time, it sends off this request, and then JavaScript moves on in the code right away. And so it goes right here to this next line. And this, of course, fires off another AJAX call immediately, way before the data of Portugal has actually arrived. So again, we will have 2 AJAX calls happening at the same time. And so whatever one arrives first will then fire the load event first. And so if the first one is the AJAX call for the USA, well, then the first element that's going to be printed here will, of course, be the one from the USA. And only after that, the data for Portugal arrives. And then this callback function here is called with the data of Portugal. And of course, the same would be true no matter how other requests we would fire off here. Let's say Germany here. And so now we actually got the data in the same order, but so now it's actually completely different. And so this confirms what I just explained before. Now, if we actually wanted these requests to be made in a specific, like predefined order, then we would basically have to chain the requests, which means to make the second request only after the first request has finished. And that's actually what we're going to do in the next lecture, so that I can show you something that we developers call callback hell.